Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into a story that will take us through the winding streets of a mysterious village, into the heart of an ancient workshop, and through the very fabric of time itself. This is a tale about curiosity, consequence, and the weight of choices that echo across decades. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let me tell you about Thomas, a young apprentice who discovered that some secrets are kept hidden for very good reasons. The village of Willowmere sits in a valley so remote that most maps forget to include it. Not because cartographers are careless, but because there's something about the place that makes it easy to overlook, as if the village itself prefers to remain unnoticed. The houses cluster together like conspirators sharing secrets, their timber frames dark with age and weather, their thatched roofs patched so many times they resemble patchwork quilts stitched by indecisive seamstresses. Narrow cobblestone streets wind between the buildings in patterns that make no logical sense. You might walk down Shepherd's Lane thinking you're heading east toward the market square, only to find yourself somehow back where you started, or worse, on a street you could swear didn't exist 5 minutes ago. The locals navigate these contradictions with ease, barely noticing when Mill Street becomes Church Road without warning, or when the alley behind the bakery sometimes leads to the churchyard and sometimes to the village green. The village sits at the bottom of a valley, ringed by hills covered in ancient oak and ash trees. In summer, these hills glow green and gold in the sunlight. In winter, they stand like sentinels wrapped in mist and snow. But it's autumn that truly defines Willowmere, because every year, without fail, in the last week of October, the fog comes. This isn't ordinary fog. It doesn't drift in gradually from the surrounding hills or roll off the small stream that runs through the village center. Instead, it appears suddenly, as if summoned, usually around 3 in the afternoon, when the sun is still high enough to cast shadows. One moment the air is clear, and the next, thick white fog fills every street and alley, pressing against windows and doorways like a living thing seeking entry. The fog has peculiar properties. It muffles sound in strange ways, swallowing footsteps completely, while allowing voices to carry impossibly far. People report seeing figures moving through it, shapes that walk with purposeful strides but vanish when approached. Clocks behave oddly during the fog days, running fast or slow, sometimes stopping entirely for hours before suddenly starting again. And there's the smell, faint but distinctive, like ozone mixed with old paper and something else nobody can quite identify, something that makes the back of your throat tingle and your head feel light. The villagers have lived with the fog for generations. They have rules about it, unwritten but universally understood. Don't go walking alone when the fog is thick. Don't call out to figures you see in it unless you're certain who they are. Don't trust your sense of direction. And above all, don't be outside when the church bell strikes midnight during fog nights. Nobody remembers why that last rule exists, but nobody questions it either. There are stories, of course, whispered over kitchen tables and in the warm corners of the Three Bells Inn, about those who ignored the rules and were never quite the same afterward. Old Margaret Finch claimed she once followed what she thought was her husband through the fog, only to find herself standing in front of a house that had burned down 30 years prior, watching smoke pour from windows that no longer existed. When the fog cleared, she was back on her own street, but her hair had turned white, and she never spoke of what she'd seen inside that phantom house. Then there was young Peter Ashworth, who insisted he'd walked through the fog one evening and emerged to find the entire village speaking a language he didn't understand, until he realized they were speaking backwards. He said it lasted for hours, before everything suddenly snapped back to normal, leaving him with a persistent stutter that took years to fade. These stories accumulated over decades, becoming part of Willowmere's identity. The fog was dangerous, yes, but it was their fog, their peculiarity. Visitors found it unsettling, but the locals had adapted, incorporating its mysteries into their daily lives, the way people in other places adapted to harsh winters or storm seasons. The village had other oddities, too, things that seemed connected to the fog but persisted year-round. Certain buildings were older than they should be, their construction predating any records in the village archives. The church had a stained glass window depicting events that hadn't happened yet according to the dates carved into its frame. The village green had a standing stone that was sometimes warm to the touch, even in the depths of winter, and sometimes ice-cold in summer. But the strangest place in all of Willowmere was undoubtedly the shop on Crooked Lane, a narrow street that twisted like a corkscrew between the butcher's and the apothecary. The shop had no sign, though everyone called it the Clockmaker's workshop. Its windows were so grimy with age that peering through them was like trying to see through thick amber. The door was heavy oak bound with iron, and it only opened when it wanted to, or so people claimed. This was where our story truly begins, in that workshop, with a young man named Thomas, who would soon discover that in Willowmere, time itself was negotiable. Thomas Ashby arrived in Willowmere on a gray morning in early spring, carrying everything he owned in a battered leather satchel and wearing boots that had worn through at the heels. He was 17, tall and gangly in the way of boys who've grown too fast, with dark hair that perpetually fell into his eyes and a habit of chewing his lower lip when thinking. His hands, already calloused from farm work, were what the clockmaker noticed first. Those and the way Thomas's eyes widened with genuine wonder when he first stepped into the workshop. The workshop was a cathedral of mechanical marvels. Every wall was lined with shelves holding clocks of every conceivable design. Grandfather clocks stood like silent sentries in the corners. Mantel clocks crowded the workbench. Pocket watches hung from hooks, their chains glinting in the lamplight. Cuckoo clocks jutted from the walls at odd angles, their tiny doors closed against the morning. And everywhere, the sound of ticking, a symphony of interlocking rhythms that somehow never quite synchronized, creating a constant, complex percussion. The clockmaker himself was a figure that seemed constructed from spare parts of different people. He was shorter than average, but possessed hands of remarkable size and dexterity. His age was impossible to determine. He might have been 50 or 80, with a face that was simultaneously youthful and ancient. His eyes were the most arresting feature, pale gray like fog over water, and they seemed to look through things rather than at them. "You're the boy from the Ashby farm," he said without preamble when Thomas entered. It wasn't a question. "Your father wrote to me, said you have clever hands and a patient temperament." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, trying not to stare at a particularly elaborate astronomical clock that appeared to track the movements of planets that shouldn't be visible to the naked eye. "Patience is essential in this work," the clockmaker continued, moving to his workbench, where a dozen partially disassembled timepieces lay scattered across the scarred wooden surface. "Time is patient. It waits for no one, they say, but that's not quite accurate. Time simply is. It's we who are impatient, always rushing, always trying to outrun our own shadows." He gestured to a stool. "Sit. Watch. First lesson, observation before action. Most people want to dive in, start tinkering immediately. They break more than they fix. A good clockmaker watches, listens, feels. Every clock has a rhythm, a personality. You must learn to understand it before you can help it." Thus began Thomas's apprenticeship, and for the first few months it seemed entirely ordinary, at least by the standards of learning an unusual trade in an unusual village. He learned to identify components by touch alone, to hear the difference between a hairspring that was properly tensioned and one that was about to fail.
He learned to mix oils, to cut gears, to adjust escapements with movements so fine they were measured in fractions of millimeters. The clockmaker was a demanding but fair teacher. He explained things once, clearly and thoroughly, then expected Thomas to remember. Mistakes were treated as learning opportunities, but repeated mistakes were met with silence more cutting than any rebuke. Yet there was kindness, too, in the way the old man would make tea without asking when Thomas had been concentrating for hours, or would send him home early on days when the work had been particularly trying. Thomas lived in a small room above the workshop, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. The room was spare but comfortable, a bed, a washstand, a chest for his belongings, and a window that overlooked the tangled streets of Willowmere. At night, he would lie awake listening to the clocks below, their various rhythms combining into something that was almost like music, and he would think about time. It was strange, he reflected, how we measure our lives by it, segment our days into hours and minutes, yet time itself remains mysterious. What is time, really? Just numbers on a dial? The movement of celestial bodies? The entropy of the universe? Or something else entirely? Something we've invented to make sense of change and progression and the fact that we remember yesterday, but not tomorrow? These philosophical musings would eventually drift into sleep, and Thomas would dream of clockwork mechanisms so vast that they encompassed the whole world, gears the size of mountains turning with inexorable slowness, driving the rotation of the earth itself. The seasons cycled. Thomas learned. Summer gave way to autumn, and with autumn came the fog. Thomas had been warned about it by Mrs. Henshaw, who ran the bakery, and by the regulars at the Three Bells Inn where he sometimes took his supper. But being told about the fog and experiencing it were entirely different things. The first time it rolled in, Thomas was in the workshop, carefully regulating a bracket clock that had been running 5 minutes fast. One moment, sunlight was streaming through the workshop's dusty windows. The next, everything was white, as if someone had hung thick curtains across every window simultaneously. The clockmaker, who had been sorting through a box of spare mainsprings, looked up sharply. "Ah," he said simply, "it's time." "Time for what?" Thomas asked, watching the fog press against the glass like something alive. "It's time to be careful," the clockmaker replied. He crossed to the workshop door and shot the heavy bolt, something Thomas had never seen him do before. "The fog brings complications. Best to stay inside, keep to our work. Don't open the door for anyone unless you're certain who they are. And if you hear voices in the fog, voices you recognize, don't assume they are who they sound like." This cryptic warning sent a chill down Thomas's spine, but the clockmaker refused to elaborate. He simply returned to his work, sorting springs with focused attention, as if by concentrating on the small and mechanical, he could ignore the larger mysteries pressing against the windows. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Thomas heard sounds that made sleep impossible. Footsteps on cobblestones, though nobody should have been walking in the fog. Voices calling to each other in languages he didn't recognize. Once, distinctly, he heard the sound of many horses galloping past, though horses couldn't gallop on Willowmere's narrow, winding streets. And throughout it all, the clocks below ran wild, some racing ahead, others falling behind, their collective rhythm dissolving into chaos. By morning, the fog had cleared as suddenly as it came, and the clocks had somehow reset themselves to perfect synchronization, all showing the correct time despite their nocturnal madness. Thomas mentioned this to the clockmaker, who merely nodded as if it was expected. "The fog affects timepieces," he said. "Always has. It's one of the reasons I came to Willowmere. Nowhere else do clocks behave quite so interestingly." Thomas wanted to ask more, but something in the old man's expression suggested that line of inquiry would lead nowhere. So he returned to his work, regulating and repairing, learning his trade, and trying not to think too much about the mysteries that surrounded him.
Months passed. Winter came, harsh and cold, covering Willowmere in snow that made the village look like something from a fairy tale. Thomas became more skilled, handling increasingly complex repairs. The clockmaker began to trust him with the shop's more valuable pieces, the ones that came from wealthy patrons in distant cities who somehow knew about this remote workshop's reputation for impossible repairs. It was during this winter, on a particularly cold January evening, that Thomas first noticed the door. He had been working late, finishing a complicated repair on a marine chronometer that had somehow ended up in Willowmere despite the village being nowhere near the sea. The clockmaker had retired hours ago to his own rooms, somewhere in the back of the building, rooms Thomas had never seen and never been invited to enter. The workshop was quiet, except for the ticking of clocks and the pop and crackle of the fire in the small stove that provided heat. Thomas was tired, his eyes strained from working by lamplight, and he was considering packing up for the night when he noticed something odd. The shadows in the corner of the workshop, where the grandfather clock stood sentinel, seemed wrong. He stared at them, trying to puzzle out what bothered him, and then he realized there was a door there. Not a new door, but one that had always been there, except he was absolutely certain it hadn't been there before. Or rather, he'd looked at that corner hundreds of times and never noticed it. The door was narrow, made of the same dark wood as the workshop's walls, which was probably why it blended in so well. It had no handle, just a small brass keyhole, and hinges so perfectly fitted they were almost invisible. Thomas approached it slowly, telling himself he was being ridiculous, that of course there had always been a door there, he'd simply never paid attention. But the feeling persisted. This door had not been there before, or perhaps it had been, but had been invisible, hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, for reasons unknown, it had decided that moment was now. He reached out to touch it, and the wood was cold beneath his fingers. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with winter temperature. It was a deep cold, ancient and patient. He found himself thinking of caves, of deep, underground places where no light had ever reached. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Thomas spun around, heart hammering. The clockmaker stood at the bottom of the stairs leading to his quarters, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Do what?" Thomas asked, though he knew perfectly well. "Open that door," the clockmaker said, moving closer. His pale eyes reflected the lamplight, making them seem to glow. "Not yet. You're not ready." "Ready for what? What's behind it?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see past surfaces into deeper truths. Finally, he sighed. "Complications," he said simply. "The kind that once entered cannot be easily escaped. Go to bed, Thomas. Some mysteries reveal themselves in their own time, and that time is not tonight." Thomas wanted to argue, to demand explanations, but something in the clockmaker's tone brooked no discussion. So he went upstairs, leaving the mysterious door behind, but sleep was long in coming. He lay awake thinking about cold wood and brass keyholes and the strange weight of secrets that filled the workshop like invisible fog. And downstairs, the clocks ticked on, measuring time that was perhaps not as straightforward as anyone believed. The door became an obsession, though Thomas tried to pretend otherwise. He would find his gaze drifting toward it while he worked, wondering what lay beyond. The clockmaker never mentioned it again, and the door itself seemed to fade in and out of noticeability. Some days Thomas could see it clearly, its outline sharp against the wall. Other days he could barely make it out,
as if it were more idea than object, a possibility rather than a certainty. February turned to March. The snow melted, revealing cobblestones and the first brave shoots of crocuses. Thomas continued his apprenticeship, now trusted with even the most delicate repairs. The clockmaker began teaching him the art of creating clock faces, showing him how to paint the numerals with precise strokes, how to balance aesthetic beauty with practical clarity. "A clock face is a promise," the old man explained one afternoon, his brush moving with steady precision across a pristine white dial. "It promises to mark time faithfully, to give structure to the hours. People trust their clocks absolutely, build their lives around them. We must honor that trust." Thomas practiced on spare metal blanks, learning to make his numbers elegant but readable, his hands growing steady and sure. He was proud of his progress, proud that the clockmaker nodded approvingly at his work more often than not. But still, in quiet moments, his thoughts returned to the door. The fog came again in late March, unusually early that year. The villagers muttered about it being a bad omen, though what it might portend no one could say. The fog was thicker this time, so dense that looking out the workshop windows was like staring at a wall of white cotton. The clocks went mad as before, and Thomas barricaded himself in his room, listening to the strange sounds that echoed through the streets. This time, though, he heard something new. Or rather, he heard something that might have been there all along, but that he only now recognized. Beneath the other sounds, the footsteps and voices and impossible horse hooves, there was a deep, mechanical sound, like the ticking of an enormous clock, slow and resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the earth itself perhaps, a heartbeat of machinery buried deep beneath Willowmere.
The old man's expression flickered, surprise followed by resignation. "So you've begun to hear it. I wondered when you would. Not everyone can. It takes a certain sensitivity, a particular way of perceiving." "What is it?" The clockmaker set down the movement he'd been examining. "Come with me," he said simply, and before Thomas could respond, the old man was crossing the workshop toward the narrow door in the corner. Thomas's heart leapt. Finally, after months of wondering, he would learn what lay beyond. The clockmaker produced a key from somewhere within his vest, an ornate brass thing covered in spiral engravings. He fitted it into the keyhole, and the lock opened with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the cluttered workshop. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing darkness beyond. The clockmaker lit a lantern and gestured for Thomas to follow. "Watch your step. The stairs are steep." They were indeed steep, narrow and winding, descending into the earth beneath the workshop. The walls were stone, old stone, covered in a patina of age and moisture. The air smelled of earth and metal and that same indescribable scent that came with the fog. As they descended, Thomas became aware of sound growing louder with each step, a deep, rhythmic ticking that resonated in his chest like a second heartbeat. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling down in a tight helix that made Thomas dizzy. Just when he thought they must surely reach the center of the earth, the stairs ended, opening into a chamber that made Thomas's breath catch. The chamber was vast, far larger than should have been possible beneath the small workshop. The ceiling arched overhead, lost in shadow despite the lantern light, and covering every surface, every wall, every available space, were clocks. Not ordinary clocks, but machines of stunning complexity and beauty. Some were as small as pocket watches, others as large as carriages. They were made from brass and steel, copper and silver, some with cases of crystal that revealed their intricate inner workings. But these were not like the clocks in the workshop above.
These clocks had faces that showed impossible times, dials that tracked movements Thomas couldn't identify, hands that turned both clockwise and counterclockwise simultaneously. Some had multiple faces, concentric rings of numerals that spiraled inward to infinity. Others had no faces at all, just intricate arrangements of gears and springs that seemed to serve no practical purpose, yet were hypnotic to watch. And in the center of the chamber, dominating everything, was the source of the deep ticking. A clock so large it could only be described as a mechanism, a vast construction of bronze and gold that rose from floor to ceiling in a cylinder perhaps 20 feet across. Gears the size of cartwheels turned with ponderous grace. Pendulums swung in complex patterns that should have caused them to collide but somehow didn't. And throughout it all, that deep, patient ticking, measuring something that might have been time but felt like something more fundamental, the heartbeat of reality itself. "What is this place?" Thomas whispered, because anything louder would have felt like sacrilege. The clockmaker moved to the central mechanism, running his hand along its bronze surface with the gentle touch of a parent caressing a sleeping child. "This," he said softly, "is why I came to Willowmere. This is what I've spent the last 40 years maintaining, studying, trying to understand. This is the reason for everything." He turned to face Thomas, and his expression was grave. "What I'm about to tell you is known only to myself and one other person, and that person is long dead. The responsibility of this knowledge is heavy, Thomas. Once I tell you, you cannot unknow it. Your life will never be quite the same. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure he did. All he knew was that standing in this chamber, surrounded by impossible timepieces, felt like standing at the threshold of something momentous, and turning back now would haunt him for the rest of his life. The clockmaker began to speak, his voice low and measured, telling a story that seemed impossible, yet rang with undeniable truth. "Willowmere is old, far older than any records show. The village, you see, the buildings and streets, they are recent, mere centuries old. But beneath them lies something ancient, something that was here long before humans decided to build homes in this valley. This mechanism, this vast clock, is part of that older structure." He gestured at the bronze cylinder. "I don't know who built it or when. I found fragments of inscriptions in languages I cannot read, materials that shouldn't exist according to everything we know about metallurgy. But what I do know is what it does." He paused as if gathering courage. "This mechanism regulates time. Not simply measures it, but regulates it. Time in Willowmere doesn't flow quite like it does elsewhere. It can be adjusted. The fog you've experienced, that's a side effect, a leakage of temporal instability when the mechanism requires recalibration. The strange occurrences people report, those are moments when different times overlap, when past and future bleed into present." Thomas's mind reeled. "That's impossible. Time isn't something you can regulate. It just is." "I thought so too, once. But consider, if space can be bent and shaped, why not time? They're two aspects of the same fundamental fabric. This mechanism, whatever civilization built it, understood that. They found a way to create a pocket, a place where time is malleable, where the normal rules don't quite apply." He moved to a workbench against the wall, covered with papers and diagrams.
When I first discovered this place 40 years ago, the mechanism was failing. That's why the fog had become so frequent, so unpredictable. The temporal regulation was breaking down. I've spent 40 years learning how to maintain it, to keep it running smoothly. But I'm old now, Thomas. I need someone to continue the work after I'm gone. That's why I took you as an apprentice. Not just to teach you clockmaking, but to prepare you for this.
Thomas felt as if the world had tilted. Everything he'd learned, his entire apprenticeship, had been preparation for something he couldn't have imagined. But why me? Why not someone more qualified, someone with more experience? Because not everyone can hear it, the clockmaker replied. The mechanism calls to certain people, those with the right sensitivity, the right perception. I heard it when I was young, drawn to Willowmere from hundreds of miles away, without understanding why. And you heard it too, didn't you? Even before I brought you down here, you heard the deep ticking beneath the fog. Thomas had to admit it was true. He had heard it, felt drawn to it like a compass needle pulled toward north. The clockmaker crossed to the central mechanism and opened a panel, revealing even more complex workings within. There's more you need to know. The mechanism doesn't just regulate time passively. It can be used more actively, to move through time, to adjust it. There are controls, settings that I've only partially deciphered. I've been cautious with them, afraid of what might happen if I made a mistake. But the potential... He trailed off, lost in thought. This chamber contains my life's work, he continued, gesturing at the smaller clocks arranged around the room. Each one is an experiment, an attempt to understand some aspect of the mechanism's function. This one, he pointed to a clock with a face that seemed to show multiple times simultaneously, measures temporal elasticity. This one, another gesture, detects temporal anomalies before they manifest. And this one, he touched a particularly beautiful piece with a crystal case, can move small objects through time, though only by minutes, and not reliably. Thomas approached the crystal-cased clock, peering at its intricate workings. Inside, he could see what looked like a tiny chamber, perhaps large enough to hold a pocket watch or a ring. "You've moved things through time?" he asked, his voice full of wonder and fear. "Small things, as I said, and only as experiments to understand the principles. I would never—" The clockmaker stopped abruptly, his expression darkening. "That's not quite true. I did, once, move something more significant, and the consequences of that action have haunted me ever since." He moved to a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This was kept by the previous keeper of the mechanism, a man named Aldous Crane. He discovered this chamber in the 1780s, and he too became obsessed with its possibilities. But unlike me, he was less conscious. He tried to use the mechanism for personal gain, to change events that had already happened. The results were catastrophic. He opened the journal, revealing pages filled with tight, increasingly frantic handwriting. Crane tried to prevent a tragedy, the death of his daughter. He succeeded, in a way. He brought her back from a moment before the accident that killed her. But he didn't understand that time seeks equilibrium. You can't simply remove an event without consequences. The daughter he saved wasn't quite the daughter he'd lost. Something was different about her, something wrong. And the act of saving her created ripples, changes that affected everything around her. He turned more pages, showing Thomas sketches and diagrams.
Crane spent years trying to fix what he'd broken, but each fix created new problems. The fog grew worse. The temporal anomalies multiplied. Eventually, he realized the only solution was to undo what he'd done, to let his daughter die as she was meant to. The journal ends shortly after that decision. I found his body down here when I first discovered the chamber. He died at the controls of the mechanism, and his daughter's name was the last word written in his journal. The story sent chills through Thomas. What happened to her, the daughter? I don't know, the clockmaker admitted. There are no records of her in Willowmere's history, no grave, no mention in any document. It's as if she never existed. Or perhaps she exists in some other timeline, some parallel version of events that split off from our own. That's the danger of tampering with time, Thomas. You create branches, possibilities that shouldn't exist, and reality struggles to accommodate them. Thomas absorbed this, staring at the massive mechanism. Its slow ticking suddenly seemed ominous rather than comforting. So what do we do? Just maintain it? Keep it running? That's all we can safely do, the clockmaker said firmly. Maintain the status quo. Keep the temporal regulation stable. The alternative is chaos, a splintering of reality that could affect far more than just Willowmere. This mechanism may be local in scope, but time is interconnected. A disruption here could ripple outward, affecting everything. He closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer. I've shown you this because you need to understand what you're inheriting. The knowledge, yes, but also the responsibility. You must promise me, Thomas, that you'll never try to use the mechanism's more dangerous capabilities. No matter how tempting, no matter what you think you could accomplish or fix or change. Promise me. Thomas wanted to promise. He could see the plea in the old man's eyes, the weight of decades of secret-keeping and careful guardianship. But something held him back. Some part of him that wondered, if you have the power to change things, to fix mistakes and prevent tragedies, wasn't there a responsibility to try? I promise to be careful, he said finally, which wasn't quite what the clockmaker had asked for, but seemed to satisfy the old man nonetheless. They spent the rest of the day in the chamber, with the clockmaker showing Thomas the basics of the mechanism's maintenance. There were gears that needed periodic oiling, adjustments to be made based on celestial positions, calibrations that had to be checked daily. It was like caring for the clocks upstairs, but magnified 1,000-fold in complexity and consequence. When they finally climbed back up to the workshop, night had fallen. Thomas's mind buzzed with everything he'd learned, and he knew sleep would be elusive. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to the regular ticking of the clocks below and the deeper, resonant ticking from far beneath them, and he thought about time, about responsibility, about the weight of secrets that could reshape reality itself. And somewhere in his thoughts, a dangerous question took root. If the power existed to change things, to make them better, wasn't it wrong not to try?
Spring deepened into summer, and Thomas's education took on new dimensions. By day, he continued his regular apprenticeship, repairing clocks, crafting components, dealing with the occasional customer who made their way to Willowmere's peculiar workshop. But several times a week, he would descend those spiraling stone stairs into the chamber beneath, where the clockmaker taught him the deeper mysteries of their trade. Thomas learned to read the great mechanism's moods, to recognize when its ticking shifted in subtle ways that indicated adjustments were needed. He learned the maintenance routines, the precise measurements and calibrations that kept temporal reality stable. And slowly, cautiously, the clockmaker began teaching him about the smaller experimental clocks that lined the chamber walls. Each one represents a question, the old man explained one afternoon, pointing to a particularly unusual piece with 3 concentric faces that rotated independently. This one measures temporal density, the thickness of time in any given location. Time isn't uniform, you see. It flows at different rates in different places, though the variations are usually too small to notice. But here in Willowmere, those variations can be significant. He demonstrated, moving the clock to different parts of the chamber. The faces rotated at visibly different speeds depending on where the clock was positioned. Closer to the central mechanism, time was thicker, denser, harder to move through. Near the walls, it thinned, became more elastic. "Why does it vary?" Thomas asked, fascinated, despite his growing unease with the implications. "The mechanism creates a field," the clockmaker explained. "Like a magnet creates a magnetic field, this device creates a temporal field. Within that field, the normal rules are suspended. Time can be shaped, manipulated. But it takes enormous energy. Energy drawn from somewhere. I've never been able to determine the source. Perhaps the mechanism taps into the rotation of the Earth, or the movement of the planets, or something even more fundamental." Thomas spent hours experimenting with the various devices, learning their functions and limitations. There was a clock that could detect temporal anomalies before they became visible, giving warning of when the fog might appear. Another that measured the synchronization between different timelines, showing when parallel possibilities were drifting too close together. But the clock that fascinated Thomas most was the one the clockmaker had mentioned before, the beautiful crystal-cased piece that could move objects through time. It sat on a table by itself, surrounded by careful notes and diagrams. The clockmaker had demonstrated it once, placing a copper penny in the tiny chamber within and adjusting a series of dials on the clock's base. The mechanism had hummed, the crystal case had glowed with a faint blue light, and the penny had simply vanished. 5 minutes later, according to the clock face, it reappeared, sitting in the chamber exactly where it had been placed. 5 minutes into the future, the clockmaker had explained. That's as far as I've been able to reliably send anything. The mathematics become too complex beyond that range, too many variables to account for. And there's always the risk that the object will reappear inside something else, or that the timeline will have shifted enough that the destination moment no longer exists as originally calculated. Thomas found himself drawn to this device repeatedly, studying its construction, trying to understand the principles behind it. The clockmaker tolerated this fascination, but always with warnings. "Remember Aldous Crane," he would say. "Remember what happened when someone tried to use this power for personal reasons. The mechanism is not a toy, Thomas. It's not a tool for fixing regrets or satisfying curiosity. It's a responsibility we bear, nothing more." But Thomas was young, and youth is often convinced it can succeed where others have failed. He began conducting his own small experiments, always careful, always controlled. He would send small objects forward in time, just by minutes, carefully documenting each trial. A button, a nail, a scrap of paper with his initials written on it. Each time he'd note the exact settings, the ambient conditions, the phase of the moon, the weather, trying to find patterns, to build a more complete understanding. The clockmaker noticed, of course. Little escaped his attention. But he didn't forbid Thomas's experiments, perhaps recognizing that some lessons must be learned through careful exploration rather than prohibition. He simply monitored them, offering corrections when Thomas's methodology was flawed, providing warnings when the apprentice seemed about to push too far. "You're walking a fine line," he said one evening, watching Thomas prepare to send a small brass gear 5 minutes into the future. "There's a difference between understanding a thing
and mastering it. Make sure you know which you're pursuing." Thomas assured him it was understanding, though even he wasn't entirely sure that was true. There was something intoxicating about the work, about manipulating the fundamental fabric of reality. Every successful experiment felt like unlocking a door to possibilities undreamed of. It was during one of these experiments, on a warm July evening, that Thomas met Eleanor. He had emerged from the workshop late, his mind still buzzing with calculations and observations. The sun was setting, painting Willowmere's twisted streets in shades of gold and amber. Thomas decided to walk, to clear his head before attempting sleep. He wandered without direction, letting the village's peculiar geography guide him, and found himself eventually at the small library that occupied a converted house near the church. The library was little more than 2 rooms filled with books, but it was a treasure trove of local history, maintained by an elderly librarian who seemed to have been old since the dawn of time. Thomas had visited a few times before, curious about Willowmere's past, though he'd found frustratingly little about the mysteries that consumed his thoughts.
This evening, though, the library was being tended not by the ancient librarian, but by a young woman Thomas had never seen before. She was perhaps his own age, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, and intelligent gray eyes that studied him with frank curiosity as he entered. "We're about to close," she said, but not unkindly. "But if you need something specific, I can stay a few minutes longer." "I'm just browsing," Thomas replied, suddenly self-conscious about his ink-stained fingers and the fact that he probably smelled of machine oil. "I work at the Clockmaker's workshop. Sometimes I need to clear my head after a long day." The woman's expression shifted, curiosity deepening. "The Clockmaker's workshop? I've been trying to learn more about that place. The official records barely mention it, which is odd for a business that's supposedly been here for over a century." "You're interested in local history?" Thomas asked, moving closer to the counter where she stood. "I'm a historian," she said with a slight smile, "or trying to be. My name is Eleanor Ashworth. I came to Willowmere 3 months ago to study the village's peculiarities. There are so many anomalies in the records, gaps and inconsistencies that make no sense. It's as if the village's past keeps changing, or as if different people remember different versions of events." Thomas felt his heart quicken. Here was someone else who had noticed the strangeness of Willowmere, someone approaching it from a different angle. He wanted to tell her everything, to share the burden of knowledge that weighed on him, but the Clockmaker's warnings echoed in his mind. The secret must be kept. The responsibility was too great to share casually. "I've noticed some odd things, too," he said carefully. "The village does seem to have a flexible relationship with history." "That's one way to put it. Look at this." She pulled out a large ledger, opening it to show Thomas a page filled with handwritten entries. "This is the register of births and deaths for the 1820s. Now look at this." She produced another ledger, seemingly identical. "This is the same register, but from a different archive. They should be identical, but they're not. Different names, different dates, and both claim to be the original." Thomas examined the pages, seeing what she meant. The discrepancies were undeniable, yet both ledgers appeared equally authentic, equally aged. "How is that possible?" "That's what I'm trying to understand," Eleanor said, closing the ledgers. "Every document I examine seems to exist in multiple versions, like there are several Willowmeres overlapping, each with slightly different pasts. The locals don't seem to notice or care, but as an outsider, it's incredibly obvious." They talked until well after the library's closing time. Eleanor sharing her research, and Thomas carefully discussing the village's oddities without revealing the chamber's existence. He found himself drawn to her curiosity, her analytical mind, the way she approached mystery not with fear, but with intellectual excitement. When they finally parted, with Thomas promising to return soon to continue the conversation, he walked back to the workshop with his thoughts in turmoil. Eleanor's research was touching on the same truths he'd learned in the chamber, approaching from a historical rather than a mechanical perspective. If he shared what he knew, she might be able to help understand the mechanism better, to make sense of temporal anomalies he couldn't explain. But doing so would violate the Clockmaker's trust, would expose secrets that had been guarded for generations. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Eleanor met regularly, usually at the library after it closed. She showed him her research, page after page of documented anomalies, buildings that appeared in old photographs but no longer existed, or vice versa. People who seemed to have lived twice, their death records appearing decades apart. Events that multiple sources placed in different years, all claiming certainty. "It's as if reality here is malleable," Eleanor said one evening, spreading documents across a table. "As if the past isn't fixed, but constantly being rewritten. But that's impossible, isn't it? The past is the past. It can't change." Thomas thought of the great mechanism beneath the workshop, its vast gears slowly turning, regulating time itself. What if it could? He asked quietly. What if there were a way to alter the past, to create different versions of events? What would that look like? Eleanor considered this, taking his question seriously rather than dismissing it as fantasy. "I suppose it would look exactly like this. Multiple timelines, overlapping and contradicting, physical evidence of events that never happened in our version of history, and probably effects we can't even see, changes so fundamental they've always been true in our experience." She leaned back, studying Thomas with those penetrating gray eyes. "You know something," she said. It wasn't a question. "You know something about why Willowmere is the way it is. I've suspected it for weeks now. The way you carefully avoid certain topics, the way you choose your words when we discuss temporal anomalies. You know something." Thomas felt trapped between loyalty and truth, between the weight of keeping secrets and the relief of sharing them. He thought about the Clockmaker's warnings, about Aldous Crane's tragic attempts to change the past. But he also thought about Eleanor's mind, her ability to understand and analyze, and how much stronger they might be working together rather than separately. "If I told you," he said slowly, "you would have to keep it secret, absolutely secret. No notes in your research, no casual mentions, nothing written down where others might find it. The knowledge is dangerous." Eleanor's expression grew serious. "If it's truly that important, I can keep a secret. But are you sure you want to tell me? Once shared, you can't take it back." Thomas made his decision. "Come to the workshop tomorrow night, after the village is asleep. There's something you need to see." The next night, Thomas led Eleanor down the spiral stairs into the chamber beneath the workshop. The Clockmaker was away, visiting a supplier in a neighboring town, and Thomas had decided this was the right time, though he knew the old man might not approve. Eleanor's reaction was everything Thomas had hoped for. Wonder mixed with scientific curiosity, fear tempered by excitement.
She moved through the chamber slowly, studying each clock, examining the central mechanism with careful attention. "This is incredible," she breathed. "This is what's causing the anomalies. This is why Willowmere's history is so unstable. But who built it? When?" "We don't know," Thomas admitted. "The Clockmaker has theories but no proof. All we know for certain is what it does: regulates time, creates a localized area where temporal rules are flexible, and that it requires constant maintenance to remain stable. He showed her Aldous Crane's journal, letting her read about the tragic experiment and its consequences. Eleanor absorbed the information quickly, her historian's mind making connections and drawing conclusions. "So that's why some records show his daughter's death and others don't," she said. "He created a branch, a timeline where she survived, but then collapsed it when he realized the damage he was causing. But collapsing a timeline doesn't erase its effects entirely. Echoes remain, physical evidence that persists even though the events technically never happened in our version of reality." Thomas was impressed by how quickly she grasped the implications. "Exactly. And that's why we have to be so careful. Every manipulation of time creates ripples, changes that cascade outward in unpredictable ways." Eleanor spent hours in the chamber that night, examining Thomas's experiments, studying his notes, asking questions that often Thomas couldn't answer. She approached the temporal anomalies like puzzles to be solved, applying rigorous historical methodology to supernatural phenomena. And she began to see patterns Thomas had missed, connections between his experimental data and her historical research. "Look at this," she said, comparing Thomas's log of temporal density measurements with a timeline she'd created of Willowmere's documented anomalies. "Every time the temporal density spikes, there's a corresponding increase in historical inconsistencies. The mechanism isn't just regulating time in the present, it's constantly adjusting the past, fine-tuning reality to maintain temporal equilibrium." This revelation was both fascinating and disturbing. It meant that the past was never truly fixed, that reality was constantly being rewritten in subtle ways to maintain temporal equilibrium. No wonder Willowmere's history was so confused. It was literally fluid, changing to accommodate the mechanism's regulatory adjustments. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Eleanor worked together, combining his mechanical knowledge with her historical expertise. They documented everything, creating a comprehensive record of the mechanism's effects and behaviors. Eleanor proved invaluable in interpreting the results, seeing implications Thomas would have missed. But their collaboration led to more ambitious questions. If small objects could be sent through time, what about larger ones? If minutes could be traversed, what about hours or days? The theoretical possibilities were intoxicating, and both Thomas and Eleanor found themselves pushing boundaries, conducting experiments that grew increasingly bold. "We should try sending something back," Eleanor suggested one evening, her eyes bright with excitement. "All of your experiments have been forward in time, but the mechanism can clearly affect the past. What if we could send an object backward, even just by an hour?" Thomas felt the familiar pull of curiosity warring with the clockmaker's warnings. "That's more dangerous. Forward in time, we're just delaying an object's existence. Backward, we're potentially creating paradoxes, overlaps. What if the object interacts with its past self?" "We'll be careful," Eleanor insisted. "We'll send something simple, something that can't cause much impact. A stone, maybe, or a coin, just to see if it's possible to understand the principles better." Against his better judgment, Thomas agreed. They spent days preparing, calculating trajectories through time, accounting for the Earth's movement, the changes in the chamber's position relative to space. The mathematics were daunting, but Eleanor had a gift for complex calculations, and between them, they created what they believed was a safe experiment. They chose a small, smooth stone marked with a distinctive symbol so they could identify it clearly. The plan was simple: send the stone back exactly 1 hour. They would wait, and if the stone appeared in the designated spot an hour before they sent it, they would know the experiment had succeeded. Thomas configured the crystal-cased clock, adjusting settings he'd never touched before, following calculations that made his head ache. Eleanor marked the exact time and position where the stone should appear. Then, with trembling hands, Thomas placed the stone in the chamber and activated the device. The crystal glowed blue, brighter than Thomas had ever seen it. The mechanism's deep ticking seemed to accelerate, becoming almost frantic. Reality bent around the stone, visible as a sort of shimmer in the air, and then the stone was gone. "Now we wait," Eleanor said, checking her pocket watch. "In approximately 58 minutes, we should have known whether it worked, because the stone will have already appeared an hour ago." The logical tangle of that statement made Thomas's head spin, but he understood the principle. They sat in the chamber, watching the designated spot as the minutes ticked by. 40 minutes. 30. 20. And then, with 15 minutes remaining, something went wrong. The fog appeared suddenly, impossibly, inside the chamber. It shouldn't have been possible. They were deep underground, in a sealed space. But temporal fog wasn't bound by physical barriers. It roiled and twisted, filling the chamber with white opacity. And within it, Thomas saw shapes, moving. "Eleanor," he called, reaching for her. But she was already lost in the fog, her voice coming from a direction that shouldn't exist. "Thomas, something's wrong. The mechanism, it's—" Her words cut off, replaced by a sound Thomas had never heard before. The great mechanism screaming. Its guitars ground and shrieked, its pendulum swung wildly, and the deep ticking became chaotic, a cacophony of temporal breakdown. Thomas stumbled toward where he thought the central mechanism stood, hands outstretched, and touched bronze that was ice-cold one moment and burning hot the next.
Through the fog, he caught glimpses of things that shouldn't be. The chamber as it had been centuries ago, pristine and newly built. The chamber as it might be in the future, ruined and overgrown with strange vegetation, versions of himself. Multiple Thomases reaching for the mechanism, their faces twisted in fear or concentration or triumph. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog vanished. Thomas found himself sprawled on the floor near the central mechanism, Eleanor beside him, both gasping for breath. The chamber looked normal again, the smaller clocks ticking steadily, the great mechanism's rhythm restored to its usual deep patience. But something was different. Thomas felt it immediately, a subtle wrongness in the air, like a musical note played slightly off-key. He looked at Eleanor and saw the same recognition in her eyes. "What did we do?" she whispered. Thomas forced himself to stand, moving to the crystal-cased clock. The stone sat in its chamber, apparently having returned from its temporal journey. But when Thomas examined it closely, he saw that it wasn't quite the same stone. The symbol they'd marked it with was there, but reversed, mirror-imaged. And it was warm to the touch, unnaturally so, as if it had been somewhere very cold and was still equilibrating to normal temperature. "We changed something," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "The experiment worked, but not the way we planned. The stone went back, but something about the process destabilized the mechanism, caused a temporal cascade. We need to figure out what changed, what's different now." They spent the rest of the night examining the chamber, checking instruments, comparing notes with what they'd written before the experiment, and slowly they realized the extent of their mistake. Small things were different. The arrangement of some tools on the workbench, the color of a ribbon Eleanor had tied around her research notes, the time shown on several of the experimental clocks. Individually, these were tiny changes, barely noticeable. But together, they suggested that reality had been rewritten, that they were now in a timeline slightly different from the one they'd started in. "We have to tell the Clockmaker," Thomas said finally, as dawn light began to filter down the spiral stairs. "He needs to know what we've done. Maybe he can fix it, restore things to how they were." Eleanor nodded, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. "I'm sorry. This is my fault. I pushed for the experiment." "We both did it," Thomas said. "We both chose to ignore the warnings. Now we have to face the consequences together." But when they emerged from the chamber into the workshop above, they discovered that consequences had only begun to manifest. The workshop looked the same, yet subtly different. Tools were in slightly different positions. Some clocks showed times that didn't match others, and outside the window, Willowmere itself seemed to have shifted. The street was wider than Thomas remembered. The buildings across from the workshop painted different colors.
And when the clockmaker returned later that morning, he took one look at Thomas and Eleanor's faces, at the terrified guilt written there, and he simply said, "Tell me everything." Section 5. Unraveling the Past. The clockmaker listened without interruption as Thomas and Eleanor explained what they'd done. The experiment with sending the stone backward through time, the fog that had appeared, the subtle changes they'd noticed afterward. His expression remained neutral throughout, but Thomas could see tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair. When they finished, silence filled the workshop, broken only by the ticking of countless clocks, each now seeming to tick with accusatory insistence. Finally, the clockmaker spoke. "I warned you," he said quietly, and the disappointment in his voice was harder to bear than anger would have been. "I told you what happened to all this crane. I explained the dangers of manipulation, the cascading effects of changing temporal flow. And yet you proceeded anyway, driven by curiosity and the arrogance of thinking you could control what so many before you could not." "We're sorry," Eleanor began, but the clockmaker held up a hand. "Sorry doesn't undo what's been done. Sorry doesn't restore the timeline you've damaged. You've created a branch, a split in reality, and now we exist in a version of events slightly offset from the original. Most people won't notice. The changes you caused are subtle, small shifts in position and color and timing. But you've weakened the mechanism's stability. You've made it harder for temporal equilibrium to maintain itself. And worst of all, you've opened a door." "A door?" Thomas asked, dread pooling in his stomach. The clockmaker stood and paced to the window, looking out at the shifted street. "The mechanism exists to regulate time in this location, to keep it flowing smoothly. But time, like water, wants to flow naturally, without artificial channels and dams. Every intervention, every manipulation weakens the mechanism's ability to maintain control. Do it enough, push hard enough, and eventually time will break free entirely. The fog will become constant. Timelines will collapse into each other, past and future and present, all existing simultaneously. Willowmere will become a temporal maelstrom, uninhabitable, incomprehensible." He turned back to face them. "That's the door you've opened. Not fully, not yet, but you've loosened it, made the next breakdown easier, the next catastrophe more likely. And the worst part, we can't simply undo what you did. The stone has been backward through time. That's a fixed point now, an event that occurred. Removing it would create even worse paradoxes."
"Perhaps," the clockmaker admitted, "but it will require understanding what actually happened during your experiment, tracing the exact nature of the changes you caused. That means research, careful investigation, and time. Ironically, time is what we may not have enough of." He moved to his workbench and began pulling out papers, diagrams, instruments Thomas had never seen before. "Both of you will help. Thomas, you know the mechanism and the experiments I've conducted. Eleanor, you have access to Willowmere's historical records. Between us, we need to map every change, every alteration to the timeline. Only then can we determine how to stabilize the situation." Thus began what Thomas would later remember as the most intensive period of his life. They worked around the clock, sometimes literally, with shifts rotating so that someone was always monitoring the mechanism, always checking for new instabilities. The clockmaker proved to have resources and knowledge he'd never revealed before, producing documents in languages Thomas didn't recognize, diagrams of temporal mathematics that bent the mind to contemplate. Eleanor threw herself into the historical research with desperate energy, comparing multiple versions of records, documenting every discrepancy, building a timeline of the timeline's changes. She discovered that Willowmere's history was even more fluid than she'd thought, with major events sometimes recorded differently in different sources, as if the past was constantly being edited and revised. "Look at this," she said one night, showing Thomas a series of newspaper clippings from the village archive. "The Great Fire of 1843. This article says it destroyed the east side of the village. This one says the west side. This one says there was no fire at all, just a series of small kitchen accidents. It's as if reality can't decide what actually happened, so multiple versions coexist. Thomas examined the clippings, all apparently authentic, all yellowed with appropriate age. The mechanism has been unstable for longer than we thought. Maybe our experiment didn't start the breakdown. Maybe it just accelerated something that was already happening. That's cold comfort, Eleanor replied, but Thomas could see she was thinking, drawing connections. If the instability is long-standing, then maybe the solution isn't to undo our specific experiment, but to address the underlying cause, something about the mechanism itself, some flaw in its design or operation that allows temporal drift. They brought this theory to the Clockmaker, who considered it with interest. "You may be right," he said slowly. "I've always assumed the mechanism was perfectly designed, that any instabilities were caused by lack of maintenance or external interference. But what if there's an inherent flaw? What if the very act of trying to regulate time creates instabilities because time isn't meant to be regulated?" This led them down new paths of investigation. The Clockmaker revealed that he'd been quietly researching the mechanism's origins for years, trying to understand who had built it and why. He showed them fragments of inscriptions he'd found in the deepest parts of the chamber, copied painstakingly onto paper. "I believe the mechanism was built as an experiment," he explained, spreading the copies across his workbench. "Not by any human civilization we know of, but by something older, something that existed before recorded history. These inscriptions, as far as I can translate them, speak of bending the river, of creating eddies in the flow. I think whoever built this was trying to prove something, to demonstrate that time could be controlled." "But they failed," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "The mechanism works, but imperfectly. It creates the very instabilities it's meant to prevent. And it's been running for so long, centuries, perhaps millennia, that the instabilities have accumulated to the point where the whole system is on the verge of collapse." The Clockmaker nodded gravely. "And your experiment may have been the proverbial last straw, the final destabilization that pushes us past the point of recovery, unless we can find a way to either perfect the mechanism or safely shut it down." Shut it down? Thomas felt panic at the thought. But if the mechanism stops regulating time, won't that cause even worse problems? "Perhaps," the Clockmaker admitted, "or perhaps time will simply return to its natural flow and the anomalies will cease. We're in unknown territory here. Everything I've done for 40 years has been based on the assumption that the mechanism must be maintained. But if the mechanism itself is the problem, then maintenance only delays the inevitable collapse." They debated long into the night, weighing options, each more uncertain than the last. And all the while, subtle signs of increasing instability appeared around Willowmere. The fog came more frequently, sometimes for only minutes, sometimes lasting hours. People reported seeing their own doppelgangers, exact duplicates walking the streets from different timelines. Buildings would occasionally shimmer and change, as if reality couldn't decide which version of them should exist. Most disturbing were the temporal echoes, phrases or sounds that would repeat multiple times, as if time itself was stuttering. Someone would speak a sentence, and moments later, the same words would echo from empty air. A dog would bark, and the bark would repeat endlessly for a few seconds before abruptly stopping. The church bell would ring once, then the same ring would sound again and again, each repetition slightly distorted, like a bell heard through water. The villagers grew nervous, their time-honored rules about the fog no longer seeming sufficient. Some families began to leave, packing up and moving to neighboring towns, unwilling to wait and see what further deterioration would bring. The Clockmaker watched this exodus with sadness, but couldn't blame them. "They're wise to leave," he said. "If we can't stabilize things soon, Willowmere may become uninhabitable. The temporal distortions will continue to worsen until reality itself breaks down here." It was Eleanor who found the first real clue about what might be done. Deep in the library's archives, in a box of documents so old and fragile they threatened to crumble at a touch, she discovered a journal that predated even Aldous Crane. The journal had no author's name, but its dates placed it in the early 1700s, making it nearly a century older than Crane's records.
"Listen to this," she said, reading aloud to Thomas and the clockmaker in the chamber late one night. "I have discovered the regulator beneath the old church foundation. Its purpose is now clear to me. It imposes order on time's natural chaos, creates a bubble of malleability wherein the past need not remain fixed. But I have also discovered its great flaw. The mechanism draws power from temporal differential, from the tension between what is and what might be. In regulating time, it must also destabilize it, feeding on its own contradictions like a serpent consuming its tail. I fear this cannot be sustained indefinitely." The clockmaker sat back, absorbing this. So the paradox was known from the beginning. Whoever wrote this understood the mechanism's fundamental flaw. It's a temporal paradox engine. It can only regulate time by creating instabilities. "Is there more?" Thomas asked, leaning forward. "Does the journal say what should be done?" Eleanor flipped through the fragile pages carefully. The handwriting becomes erratic toward the end, harder to read, but there's a passage here. She squinted at the faded ink. "Only one solution presents itself. The mechanism must be allowed to complete its cycle. It was not meant to run perpetually, but to operate for a fixed period before something. The word is illegible. But then it says, when the cycle completes, all branches collapse, all timelines converge, and time returns to its singular flow. But the convergence point is dangerous. All versions of history will exist simultaneously for a moment before reality chooses which to preserve." Silence fell over the chamber. The implications of this passage were staggering. "A cycle," the clockmaker said finally. "The mechanism operates in cycles. I've been maintaining it, keeping it running continuously, when perhaps it was meant to stop periodically to reset. And we're now overdue for that reset, possibly by centuries." "But what happens at the convergence point?" Eleanor asked. "If all timelines exist simultaneously, even for a moment, wouldn't that be catastrophic? How does reality choose which version to preserve?" Nobody had an answer. The journal provided no further clarity, its final pages torn or too damaged to read. But the discovery gave them a new direction to explore. Over the following days, they studied the great mechanism with fresh eyes, looking for evidence of cyclical operation, for some timing mechanism or counter that would indicate when a cycle should end. Thomas found it, almost by accident, while performing routine maintenance. Deep within the mechanism, behind gears he'd never had reason to examine closely, was a dial with markings that looked like a countdown. The dial showed a large number, but it was decreasing, incrementally but steadily, with each massive tick of the central mechanism. "It's counting down," he breathed, calling the others to see. "It's been counting down for how long? Centuries? Millennia? And when it reaches zero, the cycle completes," Eleanor finished. "All timelines converge, and reality resets. But we don't know when zero arrives. Could be years from now. Could be days." The clockmaker studied the dial intensely, performing calculations in his head. "Based on the rate of decrease and the current number, I estimate approximately 3 months until the cycle completes. Perhaps less, given the recent instabilities. Your experiment may have accelerated the countdown." 3 months to prepare for an event none of them fully understood, an event that would reshape reality itself. The weight of this knowledge pressed on them all, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. They weren't trying to maintain a permanently failing system anymore. They were preparing for a transition, a completion of something that should have happened long ago. "We need to document everything,"
Eleanor said, her historian's instincts kicking in. If all timelines are going to converge, if reality is going to choose one version of history to preserve, then we need to record as many versions as we can. We need to understand what we might lose or gain. Thomas nodded. And we need to make sure the mechanism completes its cycle properly. If it fails during convergence, if something interrupts the process, the consequences could be unimaginable. We also need to warn people, the Clockmaker added. The villagers who remain deserve to know what's coming. They should have the choice to leave or to stay and witness what may be the most significant event in Willowmere's history. They divided the tasks among themselves. Eleanor would document timeline variations, creating a comprehensive record of all the different versions of Willowmere's past she could find. Thomas would monitor the mechanism, ensuring it remained stable as it approached the convergence point. And the Clockmaker would speak to the villagers, explaining as much as he could without causing panic. But as they worked, as the countdown continued its inexorable progression toward zero, they all felt the growing weight of an unanswered question. What would happen to them personally when the timelines converged? Would they survive the experience? Would they remember all the versions of reality, or only the one that was ultimately preserved? Would they even exist in the final timeline, or might they be written out of history entirely? Thomas found himself spending more time with Eleanor, their relationship deepening as they faced the uncertain future together. They would sit in the chamber late at night, surrounded by clicking clocks and temporal instruments, and talk about everything and nothing, about their lives before Willowmere, about dreams and fears, about what might come after the convergence. "Do you regret it?" Eleanor asked one such night. "The experiment that started this all? If you could go back and choose differently, would you?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I regret the damage we caused, the instability we created. But I don't regret meeting you, working with you, uncovering these mysteries. Maybe everything that's happened was meant to happen. Maybe we were always going to accelerate the countdown because the countdown needed to be accelerated. Maybe in some other timeline we didn't do the experiment and the mechanism just kept running and failing, causing worse and worse problems."
With 2 weeks left until the predicted convergence point, Willowmere had become something out of a fever dream. The village that had once existed in a single stable timeline now fluctuated between dozens, perhaps hundreds of versions of itself, all trying to occupy the same physical space simultaneously. Walking down the street became an exercise in navigating impossibility. You might start on Shepherd's Lane as it appeared in the 1920s, with motor cars parked along the curb and electric street lamps replacing the old gas fixtures. Tick 10 steps, and suddenly you'd be in the 1870s, surrounded by horse-drawn carriages and oil lamps. 10 more steps might bring you to a version of the street that had never existed in linear history, where the buildings were constructed in architectural styles that wouldn't be invented for decades, or where stores that had burned down in 1843 stood intact and thriving. The few remaining villagers adapted with the peculiar resilience humans show when faced with the completely impossible. Mrs. Henshaw continued to run her bakery, even though it existed in 3 different centuries simultaneously, her shop flickering between gas ovens, coal ranges, and wood-fired brick hearths. She simply baked bread in whichever era she happened to be experiencing at the moment, and her customers learned to bring appropriate currency for whatever time period they encountered. The Three Bells Inn became a meeting place for people from different timelines, where a merchant from 1805 might find himself sharing a table with a farmer from 1967, both of them in Willowmere experiencing 1889, or all 3 times at once. Conversations became surreal, with people referencing events that hadn't happened yet for some listeners and were ancient history for others. Thomas, Eleanor, and the Clockmaker spent almost all their time in the chamber now, monitoring the mechanism as it approached its completion cycle. The countdown dial moved steadily toward 0, but the mechanism's behavior became increasingly erratic. Gears would suddenly spin backward, pendulums would swing in impossible directions,
and the deep ticking would sometimes speed up or slow down unpredictably. "It's struggling," the clockmaker explained one evening, his face haggard with exhaustion. He'd aged visibly in recent weeks, as if the temporal chaos were wearing on him more than the others. The mechanism is trying to maintain regulation while simultaneously preparing to release that regulation. It's contradictory, paradoxical. I'm not sure it can complete the cycle without catastrophic failure. "What would failure look like?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she didn't really want to know the answer. "Total temporal collapse," the clockmaker said bluntly. "Not convergence, but dissolution. All timelines existing forever in chaotic superposition, past and future and present, all happening at once, with no resolution. Willowmere would become a place unstuck from time entirely, existing outside normal reality. Anyone inside would be trapped in a state of eternal temporal flux." The image was nightmarish, and for a moment, the only sound in the chamber was the mechanism's labored ticking. "Then, we have to help it," Thomas said finally. "We have to find a way to ensure the cycle completes properly. The journal mentioned convergence, which implies resolution, a final stable state. There must be a way to guide the mechanism through the transition." They threw themselves into understanding the mechanism's deepest functions, areas even the clockmaker had never fully explored. Thomas discovered subsystems within subsystems, gear trains and escapements that served purposes he could only guess at. Some appeared designed to store temporal energy, whatever that meant. Others seemed to be measuring and adjusting reality itself in ways that defied comprehension. Eleanor, meanwhile, had made a disturbing discovery in her historical research. She found multiple accounts scattered across different timelines and different document versions of previous convergences. They were described in metaphorical, almost mythological language: the day the world changed, when history rewrote itself, the great forgetting. But the descriptions matched what they were about to experience. "It's happened before," she told Thomas and the clockmaker, spreading her findings across a table that was simultaneously made of oak, pine, and some synthetic material that wouldn't be invented for another century. "The mechanism has completed its cycle multiple times throughout history. Each time, timelines converge, reality resets, and most people don't remember that anything happened. Their memories are adjusted to match whatever timeline becomes dominant." "Most people?" Thomas caught the implication. "But not everyone?" "The keepers remember," Eleanor said, pointing to one particular account from a journal dated 1623. "Those who work with the mechanism, who understand its nature, they retain memories of all timelines during the convergence. They're the ones who witness reality making its choice. And sometimes—" She paused, hesitating.
"Sometimes what?" the clockmaker prompted gently. "Sometimes they have to help reality choose. When multiple timelines are equally stable, equally viable, someone has to tip the balance. The keeper becomes a sort of arbiter, their choice determining which version of history becomes real." The weight of this revelation settled over them like a physical thing. The clockmaker would be that arbiter, making choices that would reshape not just Willowmere, but potentially rippling out to affect the wider world. And Thomas and Eleanor, as his assistants, would remember the timelines that were lost, carrying knowledge of histories that would never have existed. "That's why keepers often die shortly after convergence," the clockmaker said quietly, as if this was something he'd suspected but never confirmed. "The strain of holding multiple timelines in your mind simultaneously, of choosing between them, of watching realities die. It's too much for most people to bear." "You knew," Thomas said, not quite accusingly, but close. "You knew this might kill you, and you were preparing to face it alone?" "I'm old," the clockmaker replied simply. "I've lived a full life. I made my peace with this responsibility years ago. But now—" he looked at Thomas and Eleanor, his expression complex. "Now I'm not alone. And I don't know if that makes things better or worse. I don't want to see you hurt by this. We made our choice when we did that experiment. We're part of this now, for better or worse. We'll face the convergence together."
As the final week approached, the temporal chaos reached a crescendo. The fog no longer appeared and disappeared. It was simply there, constant and all-pervading, filled with shapes and sounds from countless different times. The chamber beneath the workshop became the only place where reality remained somewhat stable, the mechanism's presence imposing a small bubble of coherence in the surrounding chaos. Villagers who had chosen to stay barricaded themselves in their homes or gathered at the church, praying to various deities across different timelines. Some reported seeing their future selves walking beside them or encountering their past selves on the street. A few claimed to see people who had died years ago, alive and well in timelines where their deaths had never occurred. Thomas witnessed something that shook him deeply. He saw himself, another version of himself, walking through the chamber. This other Thomas was older, scarred, and carried himself with a weariness that suggested he'd lived through terrible things. When their eyes met, other Thomas simply nodded, as if he knew exactly what younger Thomas was thinking, and then faded back into temporal fog. "Was that my future?" Thomas asked Eleanor afterward, unable to shake the haunted look in his double's eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe it was a future that won't come to pass. That's what convergence means. All these possibilities exist right now, but only one will be real when it's over. That wounded version of you might be from a timeline that gets erased." The thought should have been comforting, but Thomas found it horrifying instead. That other version of him was real, experiencing genuine pain and struggle, and convergence would simply delete his existence like a mistake crossed out in a ledger. How many lives, how many entire histories would be erased when reality made it its choice? 3 days before the predicted convergence, something unexpected happened. A figure emerged from the temporal fog in the chamber, solidifying gradually like a photograph developing. It was a woman, elderly and dignified, dressed in clothes from no specific era, or perhaps from all eras at once. She looked at the three of them with eyes that held depths of knowledge and sorrow. "You're the current keepers," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "I am, was, will be the keeper from the last convergence. The mechanism has allowed me to manifest to offer guidance, as I was guided by my predecessor." The clockmaker stood slowly, studying the woman with a mixture of awe and recognition. "You're in the old records. You kept the mechanism during the convergence of 1779. They said you disappeared afterward, that you simply vanished one day." "I didn't vanish," the woman said with a sad smile. "I became part of the mechanism. My consciousness absorbed into its workings. It's what happens to keepers who make the choice during convergence. You give up your individual existence to become part of the temporal fabric itself. It's the price of arbitration." The room seemed to grow colder. The woman continued, "I'm here to warn you that the convergence will be harder than you expect. The mechanism is damaged, has been for centuries. Each cycle degrades it further. This convergence may be the last one it can complete, and if it fails—" "Total temporal collapse," the clockmaker finished. "We know. We've been working to ensure the cycle completes properly." The woman shook her head. "Ensuring completion isn't enough. Someone must guide the convergence, actively shape which timeline becomes dominant. The mechanism can't make that choice anymore. It's too degraded. One of you must merge with it, become part of its decision-making process. And that person will cease to exist as an individual. Your consciousness will be distributed across all of time, aware of every moment simultaneously, unable to experience linear existence ever again." The implications were staggering. Someone would have to sacrifice not just their life, but their very identity, their sense of being a single continuous person experiencing time from past to future. "I'll do it," the clockmaker said immediately. "I'm old. I've lived a full life. I made my peace with this responsibility years ago. But now—" he looked at Thomas and Eleanor, his expression complex. "Now I'm not alone. And I don't know if that makes things better or worse. I don't want to see you hurt by this."
"No," Thomas said, surprising himself with his certainty. This is my responsibility. My experiment accelerated the breakdown. If anyone should pay the price, it's me. That's not how responsibility works, Eleanor interjected. We all made choices that led here. But more importantly, whoever merges with the mechanism needs specific qualities. They need to understand both the mechanical operation and the historical context, need to be able to see the implications of different timeline choices. The Clockmaker understands the mechanism best. Thomas, you understand the recent changes in experiments, but I'm the historian. I've documented more timeline variations than anyone. I can see the patterns, understand which versions of history lead to better outcomes. You're not sacrificing yourself, Thomas said firmly. I won't allow it. It's not your choice to allow or prevent, Eleanor replied, her voice gentle but unyielding. The mechanism will choose, based on who's most compatible, who can merge most completely. We don't control that. The elderly keeper watched this exchange with sympathy. She's right. The mechanism will recognize who should merge with it. All you can do is be willing. When the convergence begins, the mechanism will reach out, and one of you will feel the call more strongly than the others. Resist, and the convergence fails. Accept, and you become eternal and alone, experiencing all of time but belonging to none of it. She began to fade, her form becoming translucent. I don't regret my choice, she said as she disappeared. Loneliness is painful, but existence has meaning even when it's not lived in linear time. Whatever happens, remember, the mechanism was built with purpose, and that purpose is good, even if we don't fully understand it. Trust that. And then she was gone, leaving them alone with the ticking of countless clocks and the weight of impossible choices. The final days passed in a blur of preparation and dread. They tried to make the chamber as stable as possible, to give the mechanism the best chance of completing its cycle successfully. Thomas checked and rechecked every gear and spring, oiling, adjusting, ensuring everything was in optimal condition. Eleanor compiled her research into a final document, a comprehensive record of all the timeline variations she'd discovered, bound in leather and hidden where it might survive the convergence. The Clockmaker prepared them both for what they might experience during the convergence itself. You'll see everything at once, every version of Willowmere's history, every possible timeline, all existing simultaneously. Most people's minds simply shut down at that point, unable to process the contradictions. But if you can stay conscious, if you can maintain your sense of self amid the chaos, you'll witness the mechanism making its choice. You'll see reality crystallizing from infinite possibility into singular actuality. And one of us will be part of that process, Thomas said quietly. Yes, one of us will become the choice itself, our consciousness distributed across all the timelines, guiding them toward convergence. It's said that for a moment, that person will be the most powerful being in existence, able to shape reality itself. And then that power and that identity dissolve, spreading across all of time, becoming part of the fabric of existence rather than a single thread within it. They spent their last night before convergence not in the chamber, but in the workshop above, sitting among the normal clocks that still ticked with comforting regularity despite the chaos outside. Thomas and Eleanor sat close together, finding comfort in simple presence. I keep thinking about all the versions of us that exist in other timelines, Eleanor said softly. In some, we never met. In some, you ignored the Clockmaker's warnings and destroyed everything years ago. In some, we're old together, having lived through decades of relative normalcy. All those versions are equally real right now, all existing simultaneously. Which one do you hope survives? Thomas asked. She considered this. One where we tried to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Where we took responsibility for our mistakes. Where we didn't let fear prevent us from caring about each other. Beyond that, she shrugged, reality will choose based on stability, on which timeline creates the least paradox, the most coherence. Our hopes don't really factor into the equation. Maybe they do, Thomas suggested. If one of us merges with the mechanism, becomes part of the choice, then our hopes become part of the equation.
We get to tip the balance, choose which aspects of which timelines to preserve. That's a lot of power for anyone to have, and a lot of responsibility. How do you choose which reality deserves to exist? They debated this through the night, exploring the philosophical implications, the ethical quandaries. Should you preserve the timeline where the most people are happy, even if it means erasing timelines where different people existed? Do you prioritize the present, or try to set up the best possible future? Is it even moral to make such a choice, or should you let the mechanism decide randomly? Dawn broke over a Willowmere that existed in a dozen different centuries at once, and the countdown dial showed mere hours until convergence. They descended into the chamber one final time, the three of them plus the mechanism, ready to face whatever came next. The mechanism's ticking had become irregular, almost frantic. Gears ground and shrieked, pendulums swung in impossible patterns, and the temporal energy in the chamber was palpable, making the air feel thick and charged like before a thunderstorm. "It's starting," the clockmaker said, checking the countdown dial. "The cycle is beginning its final phase. Within an hour, convergence will be upon us." Thomas felt it then, a pulling sensation, as if something at the center of his being was being drawn toward the mechanism. Beside him, Eleanor gasped, clearly feeling something similar. The clockmaker stood very still, his eyes closed, his expression of intense concentration. "I can feel it reaching out. It's looking for someone to merge with, someone who can guide the convergence."
The pulling intensified, becoming almost painful. Thomas moved toward the mechanism without consciously deciding to, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. Eleanor did the same from the other side. The clockmaker opened his eyes and stepped forward as well. They stood around the massive bronze cylinder, each feeling the call of the mechanism, each knowing that in moments one of them would cease to be an individual and become something vast and strange and eternal. The mechanism's ticking reached a crescendo, became a roar like thunder, and the chamber filled with white light brighter than the sun. Through the light, Thomas saw timelines spreading out like branches on an infinite tree, each one equally real, each one calling to him to preserve it, to make it the dominant reality. He saw Willowmere as it was, as it had been, as it might be. He saw versions where the mechanism had never been built, where the village was normal and unremarkable. Versions where the mechanism had failed catastrophically centuries ago, where temporal chaos had consumed not just the village, but spread across the entire world. Versions where it had succeeded perfectly, where time flowed smoothly and predictably, with no anomalies at all. And he saw versions of himself, of Eleanor, of the clockmaker. Timelines where they lived long, happy lives. Timelines where they died young. Timelines where they never existed at all. The multiplicity was overwhelming, too much for any human mind to contain, and Thomas felt his sense of self beginning to fragment under the weight of infinite possibility. But then he felt something else, Eleanor's hand in his, her presence anchoring him even as reality dissolved around them, and the clockmaker's voice, steady and calm, speaking words that cut through the chaos. "Remember who you are. Hold to that. The mechanism wants to absorb you, but you must remain yourself until the choice is made, or the convergence will fail." Thomas focused on that, on the singular fact of his own existence, his own identity. He was Thomas Ashby, apprentice clockmaker, born on a farm, drawn to Willowmere by the mechanism's call. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also tried to make things right. He was here, now, present in this moment, even as all moments tried to exist simultaneously. The pulling sensation focused, narrowed, and Thomas realized with crystal clarity that the mechanism was choosing him, not because he was most qualified or most deserving, but because his consciousness was most compatible with its structure.
his understanding of mechanical systems in temporal flow matching something in the mechanism's deepest design. He could resist. He could pull back, force the mechanism to choose someone else, but doing so might cause the convergence to fail, might doom Willowmere to eternal temporal chaos. Or he could accept, could let himself dissolve into the mechanism, become part of its eternal function, guide the timelines toward coherent resolution. Thomas looked at Eleanor, at the Clockmaker, and saw in their faces the same recognition. They knew he'd been chosen. They knew what his choice would be. "Thank you," he said, his voice somehow audible despite the temporal roar. "For everything, for teaching me, for working with me, for letting me be part of something greater than myself." "Thomas!" "No," Eleanor began, but he shook his head. "It has to be me. The mechanism has chosen, and choosing differently would be selfish, would risk everything we've worked to preserve. Tell my story, Eleanor. Make sure people remember why this mattered." The Clockmaker placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You've been a good apprentice, better than I deserved. I'm sorry it ends this way." "It doesn't end," Thomas replied, understanding now what the elderly keeper meant. "It transforms. I'll still exist, just differently, across all of time instead of through it. I'll be able to see everything, to be part of everything. It's not death, it's transcendence." He wasn't sure he believed his own words, but saying them made what came next feel more bearable. Thomas turned to the mechanism and opened himself to its call completely, dropping all resistance, accepting the merger. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. His consciousness expanded, stretched across time like butter scraped over too much bread. He felt himself existing in every moment simultaneously, experienced the mechanism's entire history and future as a single unified present. The boundaries of his identity dissolved, his singular perspective fragmented into infinite perspectives, each one real, each one him, none of them quite Thomas anymore. But then he felt something else, Eleanor's hand in his, her presence anchoring him, even as reality dissolved around them. And the Clockmaker's voice, steady and calm, speaking words that cut through the chaos. "Remember who you are. Hold to that. The mechanism wants to absorb you, but you must remain yourself until the choice is made, or the convergence will fail."
The last distinctly human thought Thomas had was a hope, that the timeline he'd chosen was a good one, that the people he cared about would be happy in it, that his sacrifice would mean something beyond just technical success. And then Thomas Ashby ceased to be a person and became part of the mechanism, part of time itself, conscious but no longer individual, eternal but no longer alive in any conventional sense. In the chamber, Eleanor and the Clockmaker watched as Thomas's body became translucent, then transparent, then vanished entirely, his physical form dissolving into the mechanism as his consciousness merged with it. The temporal roar faded to silence, and the white light dimmed to nothing. The mechanism's ticking slowed, steadied, became deep and regular and calm. The countdown dial showed zeros across all its registers. The cycle was complete. And in the sudden quiet, Eleanor wept for the boy who had given up his existence to save a village, who had become eternal in order to preserve linear time, who had sacrificed self to become selfless. Section 7. The Choice. The chamber was silent except for the mechanism's steady, deep ticking. No more grinding gears, no more impossible pendulum movements, just the patient rhythm of a machine that had completed its purpose and was now returning to its normal regulatory function. The crisis was over. The convergence had succeeded. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the spot where Thomas had been moments before. Part of her wanted to deny what had happened, to insist he'd simply vanished into one of the many timelines and would return soon. But she knew better. She'd felt his consciousness expanding, spreading across time, dissolving into something vast and incomprehensible. Thomas wasn't coming back. Thomas, in any recognizable sense, no longer existed. The clockmaker moved slowly, checking instruments, reading dials, his movements mechanical, as if he too was running on automatic while his mind processed loss. "The timeline has stabilized," he said eventually, his voice rough. "Reality has chosen. The convergence is complete." "What timeline?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Which version did Thomas choose?" The clockmaker consulted several of his more esoteric instruments, pieces Eleanor had never fully understood. "A synthesis," he said finally. "Aspects from multiple timelines woven together. He chose carefully, preserving the best elements from different histories. Willowmere exists now with a single coherent past. No more conflicting records or contradictory memories. For most people, it will be as if the temporal chaos never happened. Their memories will have adjusted to match the preserved timeline." "But we'll remember," Eleanor said, not a question. "Yes. Those of us who witnessed the convergence, who were in the chamber when it happened, will retain memories of all the timelines. We'll remember histories that never happened, people who no longer exist. It's the burden of keepers to remember what was lost as well as what was preserved." Eleanor sank onto a bench, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "How do you live with that? How do you walk through a world where half your memories are of things that didn't happen?" "Carefully," the clockmaker replied. "You learn to distinguish between what's real in this timeline and what exists only in your memory. You learn not to mention the alternate histories to people who don't remember them. And you learn to find meaning in the preservation itself. Thomas chose this timeline for a reason. Our job now is to honor that choice by living well in the reality he created." Eleanor thought about Thomas's last words, his hope that he was making the right choice. She wondered what criteria he used, how he'd decided which histories deserved to exist and which should be erased. It was a godlike power, the ability to literally determine reality, and it had been given to a 17-year-old apprentice clockmaker who'd been in Willowmere less than a year. But perhaps that was appropriate. Thomas hadn't been weighed down by decades of assumptions and biases. He'd approached the choice with a fresh perspective, with the idealism of youth tempered by the hard lessons of consequence. He'd made mistakes, yes, but he'd taken responsibility for them, and in the end, he'd paid the ultimate price to fix what he'd helped break. "We should go up," the clockmaker said gently. "See what the village looks like now. The timeline has changed, but the chamber exists outside normal temporal flow. We won't know what the preserved reality looks like until we emerge." Eleanor followed him up the spiral stairs, her legs heavy with exhaustion. When they emerged into the workshop, everything looked the same, yet subtly different. The clocks were all showing the correct time, synchronized perfectly. Through the window, Willowmere was visible in normal daylight. No fog, no temporal distortions, just an ordinary autumn afternoon. But when Eleanor looked closer, she noticed differences. The building across the street was painted blue instead of white, though she had clear memories of it being white. The street was slightly narrower than before, and through the window she could see the church spire, except it wasn't quite the same church spire. This one had weather vanes where the old one had a simple cross. "Different timeline," the clockmaker confirmed. "Thomas wove together elements from multiple histories. We're seeing the result of his choices playing out." They stepped outside, and Eleanor felt dizzy as conflicting memories washed over her. She remembered this street as it had been in the original timeline before her experiment with Thomas had destabilized things. But she also remembered multiple other versions, variations she documented in her research. And now here was a new version, a synthesis, and her mind was struggling to reconcile all these overlapping recollections. People walked past, going about their business, entirely unaware that reality had just been fundamentally rewritten.
To them, this is how Willowmere had always been. Only Eleanor, the clockmaker, and the mechanism itself remembered otherwise.
They walked through the village, cataloging changes. The bakery was in a different location, run by a Mrs. Henshaw who was somehow both familiar and subtly different from the one Eleanor remembered. The Three Bells Inn had a different name now, the Brass Bell, but still occupied the same building and served the same function. The library where Eleanor had worked existed, but was now located in what had been a private house in the old timeline. "It's like seeing a painting that's been touched up," Eleanor said. "The overall composition is the same, but individual details have been adjusted." They found a bench in the village green and sat, watching Willowmere exist in its new unified timeline. The green had a standing stone Eleanor didn't remember, or rather, she remembered it from one of the alternative timelines she'd documented, but it hadn't existed in what she'd thought of as the main timeline before. Thomas had apparently liked that version and added it in. "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked. "The crisis is over. The convergence is complete. What's our purpose?" The clockmaker was quiet for a long time before answering. "The mechanism still needs maintenance. Without Thomas, that responsibility falls entirely to me again, though I can train another apprentice eventually. As for you, you're the historian who remembers all the timelines. I imagine there's value in documenting what was lost, what was preserved, and what was synthesized. Someone should record the truth, even if most people will never believe it." Eleanor nodded slowly. That made sense. It would give her purpose, a way to honor Thomas's sacrifice. She could compile a complete history of Willowmere that was and Willowmere that is, a record of the convergence and the choices that shaped the current reality. But as she thought about it, another question nagged at her. The elderly keeper, the woman who appeared to warn us, she said the mechanism was degrading, that this might be the last convergence it could complete. What happens next time? In another century or two, or whenever the cycle comes around again? The clockmaker's expression grew grave. "I don't know. The mechanism is ancient, and each cycle damages it further. Perhaps Thomas's sacrifice bought us time. Perhaps his integration into its workings will help stabilize it. Or perhaps the next convergence will be the last, and afterward the mechanism will fail permanently." "And if it fails?" "Then time in Willowmere returns to natural flow. No more regulation, no more malleable past. The village becomes normal, ordinary, undistinguishable from thousands of other small villages. The price of that normality is that we lose the mechanism's protection, its ability to smooth over temporal rough spots and resolve paradoxes. Any time-related problems would be permanent, unfixable." Eleanor considered this. Maybe that wouldn't be so bad. Normal has its appeal. Perhaps, the clockmaker agreed, but normal also means being subject to the full weight of causality, unable to adjust or correct. Every mistake is permanent, every tragedy unchangeable. The mechanism's regulation has protected Willowmere from the worst of what time can do. Losing that protection would be significant. They sat in silence, watching villagers go about their lives, blissfully unaware of the vast machinery beneath their feet, the sacrifices that had been made to preserve their reality. Children played near the standing stone, elderly couples walked arm in arm, shopkeepers called out greetings to regular customers. Life, ordinary and precious and entirely dependent on mechanisms most people would never know existed. Eleanor felt a strange doubling of perception. She could see these people as they existed now in the preserved timeline Thomas had chosen. But she could also remember
other versions of them from alternative timelines, lives they'd lived differently, choices they'd made that had been erased. Mr. Patterson the butcher had been married to a different woman in one timeline, had 3 sons instead of 2 daughters in another, had died young in a third. All those versions were real, had been him, and now all but one were gone. Was that murder? Had Thomas committed mass murder on an inconceivable scale by choosing one timeline over others? Or was it preservation, saving the one reality that could actually exist by letting go of possibilities that were inherently unstable? Eleanor didn't have an answer. Perhaps there was no answer. Or perhaps the answer was that both interpretations were simultaneously true. Thomas destroyed infinite possibilities to preserve one actuality. The morality of that act might be impossible to judge by normal ethical standards. "I can hear them sometimes," the clockmaker said quietly. "The erased timelines. They leave echoes, whispers in the temporal fabric. When I'm in the chamber late at night, I sometimes catch glimpses of Willowmeres that don't exist anymore. Timelines that Thomas chose not to preserve. They're like ghosts, not quite real, but not entirely gone either." "Is Thomas among those echoes?" Eleanor asked, not sure she wanted to know the answer. "Thomas is everywhere and nowhere now. He's distributed across all of time now, his consciousness woven into the mechanism's function. In a sense, he's aware of every moment simultaneously, experiencing the past and present and future as a single, unified now. But he's not the Thomas we knew anymore. That individual identity is gone, dissolved into something vaster." Eleanor found tears running down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She mourned for the boy she knew, the clever apprentice with ink-stained fingers and an insatiable curiosity. He'd given up everything, his past, his future, his very identity, to save a village he'd only known for a year. It was heroic and tragic and completely unfair. He made a choice, not an easy choice, but one he made consciously and deliberately. That has to count for something. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was an active participant in his own transformation. There's dignity in that, even if it doesn't make the loss hurt less. They returned to the workshop as evening approached. The clockmaker immediately descended to the chamber to begin a thorough examination of the mechanism's post-convergent state. Eleanor stayed in the workshop proper, surrounded by normal clocks that ticked with comfortable regularity, and she began to write.
She wrote about Thomas, about their first meeting in the library, about their growing friendship and collaboration. She wrote about the experiments, the discovery of the countdown, the preparation for convergence. And she wrote about the moment he'd chosen to merge with the mechanism. His last words, the way he'd looked at her before his identity dissolved into eternal mechanical awareness. She wrote through the night, filling page after page, and as she wrote, she realized she was creating a memorial. Thomas had no grave, no body to bury, no headstone to mark his existence. His name wouldn't appear in Willowmere's official records because the timeline he'd chosen was one where he'd never come to the village. In the preserved reality, Eleanor had never met him, had conducted her historical research alone, and the convergence had been handled by the clockmaker without apprentice assistance. But Eleanor remembered. She remembered all of it, every conversation, every shared moment of discovery, every smile and argument and quiet companionship. And now she was ensuring that memory would persist in physical form, written down where it couldn't be lost or forgotten. As dawn broke, Eleanor finally set down her pen and read what she'd written. It was raw, emotional, more personal account than historical document. But it was true, and truth mattered, even when it existed outside official reality. She heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see the clockmaker emerging from the chamber. He looked exhausted but satisfied. "The mechanism is stable," the clockmaker reported, settling into his chair with a weary sigh. "More than stable, it's functioning better than it has in decades, perhaps centuries. Thomas's integration seems to have repaired damage I didn't even know existed. It's as if his consciousness is actively maintaining the system from within, constantly making tiny adjustments." Eleanor absorbed this. Thomas was still there, in a sense, still working, still serving his purpose. "Will it last?" she asked. "Or will the mechanism eventually degrade again?" "Everything degrades eventually," the clockmaker said philosophically. "But Thomas has bought us time, considerable time. The next convergence won't come for at least 2 centuries, maybe more. And when it does, the mechanism will be stronger, better able to complete the cycle on its own. He gave us that gift." Over the following weeks, Eleanor continued her writing while the clockmaker trained a new apprentice, a quiet girl from the village named Sarah, who showed aptitude with delicate mechanisms. Life in Willowmere settled into normalcy, the kind of peaceful ordinariness that the village had lacked for so long. Eleanor finished her account and bound it in leather, creating a single comprehensive volume. She titled it simply, "The Chronicle of Convergence." She gave it to the clockmaker, who placed it in the chamber beside Aldous Crane's journal, creating a library of keepers, a record that future guardians of the mechanism would need. "What will you do now?" the clockmaker asked her one afternoon. "Your work here is complete. You're free to return to your studies elsewhere, to pursue your career as a historian." Eleanor had been considering this question for days. "I think I'll stay," she said finally. "Willowmere is my home now. And someone needs to remember, to keep the true history alive even when it contradicts what everyone else believes. That's a kind of keeping too, isn't it?" The clockmaker smiled. The first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from him since the convergence. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." Years passed. Eleanor became the village librarian, curator of Willowmere's official records and secret keeper of its hidden truths. She never married, though she had offers. Her heart remained with the boy who'd become part of time itself, whose sacrifice had made everything else possible. Sometimes, late at night when the library was quiet, she would feel a presence, not threatening, just there, aware. She liked to think it was Thomas, checking in, his vast consciousness momentarily focusing on this one small point in space and time where a woman sat reading by lamplight, remembering him. The clockmaker eventually passed away peacefully in his sleep, his work complete, his burden lifted. Sarah took over as keeper, and she trained another after her, and that apprentice trained another. The line continued, generation after generation, maintaining the mechanism, protecting the secret, honoring the sacrifice that had made Willowmere's stability possible. And deep beneath the workshop, the great mechanism ticked on, patient and eternal. Within its bronze heart, distributed across every gear and spring, Thomas Ashby existed in a state beyond human comprehension. No longer a boy, no longer even recognizably human, but still somehow present, still aware, still choosing, moment by moment, to guide time's flow through this small corner of reality where a woman sat reading by lamplight, remembering him. He experienced everything simultaneously. The moment of his birth on a farm far from Willowmere, his first nervous steps into the workshop, Eleanor's smile across a library table, the convergence itself, and all the centuries yet to come. Past and future and present existed for him as a single unified now, unchanging yet constantly changing, eternal yet ephemeral. If consciousness distributed across all of time could feel emotion, Thomas felt peace. He had made his choice, and it had been the right one. The timeline he'd preserved was good, not perfect, but good.
People lived and loved and laughed in Willowmere, going about their ordinary lives blessed by stability they would never know they had. And perhaps that was the greatest mercy, that most people would never know how close they'd come to temporal dissolution, never understand the price paid for their simple linear experience of time. They would wake each morning to a yesterday that was fixed and unchangeable, and sleep each night knowing tomorrow would arrive in its proper order. Eleanor lived to be very old, her hair white as the temporal fog that no longer came. On her final day, lying in bed with the library's afternoon light streaming through the windows, she felt that presence again, stronger than ever before. And she heard, or perhaps only remembered, or perhaps experienced across time itself, Thomas's voice. "Thank you for remembering." She smiled and closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she was standing in a place that was both the chamber beneath the workshop and something infinitely larger. The mechanism stretched to infinity in all directions, and within it she could see the pattern of everything, every moment, every choice, every possibility woven together into a tapestry of staggering complexity and beauty. And there within the pattern she saw him, not as he'd been, but as he'd become, vast and intricate and completely intertwined with the fabric of existence itself. "You found me," his voice echoed through eternity. "I always knew where you were," she replied. "You were everywhere, always." "Will you stay?" he asked. The mechanism could use another keeper, someone to help guide the flow. We could be together again, in a way, not as we were, but as something new. Eleanor considered this. She could feel the pull, the same call Thomas had felt during convergence, offering her the chance to transcend linear existence, to become eternal and distributed and part of something greater than herself. But she also remembered the Clockmaker's words, that some people were meant to live in time, not across it, that witnessing and remembering and living a normal human life had its own value, its own meaning. "I don't think so," she said gently. "My work is done. I remembered you. I recorded your story. I kept the truth alive. Now it's time for me to rest, to experience whatever comes next for people who live and die in the normal way." She felt his understanding, his acceptance. "Then this is goodbye," he said. "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything, for seeing me, for working with me, for carrying my memory forward. It meant more than you know." "Goodbye, Thomas," she replied. "Thank you for saving us all." The vision faded, and Eleanor was back in her bed, the afternoon light warm on her face. She took one more breath, deep and satisfied, and let it out slowly. And in the chamber far below, the mechanism ticked on, patient and eternal, carrying within its bronze heart the consciousness of a boy who had become time itself, choosing moment by moment to keep reality flowing smoothly through a small village called Willowmere, where people lived normal lives blessed by extraordinary sacrifice they would never know about. The clocks in the workshop above ticked in perfect synchronization, measuring time that was perhaps not quite as straightforward as anyone believed, but was stable and predictable and real. And that, in the end, is all that mattered. Closing. So ends our tale of Thomas, the clockmaker's apprentice who became part of time itself. A story about curiosity and consequence, about the weight of choices that echo across decades, about sacrifice and memory, and the hidden machinery that keeps reality running smoothly while we sleep. As you drift off tonight, perhaps you'll think about the mechanisms beneath the surface of things, the hidden gears and springs that make the world work. Perhaps you'll remember Thomas and Eleanor, their friendship and their courage, their mistakes and their redemption. And perhaps as you fall asleep, you'll hear it, that deep, patient ticking, the heartbeat of time itself, carrying us all forward moment by moment, from yesterday through today into tomorrow. Sleep well, everyone. Until next time.